Hello, everybody. I'm excited to have the first video interview in the history of GoMightyCard.com. Today, I'm talking to Tyler Bridges, author of the new book, Five Laterals and a Trombone. And as you might guess, this book tells the story of one of the greatest college football games, like it or not, in the history of college football, the 1982 big game. Some people might wonder why a Stanford site like mine would be highlighting a book about a game that lives in infamy and so many memories of Stanford fans. But this book is that good. Like that's how good it is. And so I'm really excited. I read this book in 2 days. I couldn't put it down. And just an awesome book. So Tyler, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure, Hank.
The first thing I want to talk about is like, where did this journey begin for you? Like, I know that you were, I know that you went to Stanford. I know that you were in the band, before this game. But what was your reaction to this game when it happened? And kind of how has that shifted or changed, if it has, over the next 40 years?
Well, Hank, you actually asked me several questions. Let me answer the first one, which is where did the journey begin for me? I really think it began when I was 8 and 9 years old, growing up in Palo Alto, and we lived within walking distance of the Stanford campus. And on Saturdays in the fall, we would walk from our home. My dad and 2 or 3 of my sisters. We had season tickets in the end zone under the family plan. This was in the old stadium. So we would sit in the end zone, and I watched, there was a wide receiver named Gene Washington, who was a particular favorite. The Rose Bowl team of 1970, led by Jim Plunkett, the Heisman Trophy winner. In fact, I was at Stanford, they would have a spring practice between the red team and the white team. And then afterwards, they would let kids kind of play around on the field. And I took a handoff from Jim Plunkett. It must have been 1969. And my dad told me how to position my hands for the handoff. And lo and behold, it ended up in the Palo Alto Times, which was then the local newspaper, right, advertising the next year's event. So this journey about Stanford football and Five Laterals and Trombone really began when I was a kid following Stanford football. And then I guess it continued when I, got into Stanford from Pali High in 1978. I joined the band, played trombone in the band for 4 years, was an enthusiastic Stanford band member, and then graduated in June of '82. So when the play took place in November '82, Hank, listened to the game on the radio that day. I was in Washington, D.C. It was a technological marvel at that time, back in 1982, that we in Washington, D.C. could listen to the game on the radio back in the Bay Area. And so I don't remember very much about the game, except I do remember Mark Harmon kicking what we thought was the winning field goal, and me and my Stanford buddies did a give him the axe yell and went off and partied. Stanford had won the big game, and it wasn't until the next day when I picked up the Washington Post, and on the front page they said Cal won the game. So
yeah, I think that's one of the things I wanted to talk about kind of down the road here is just it's hard to imagine, for a lot of reasons. It's hard to imagine this game playing out in 2022, and it certainly wouldn't have. But one of the things that I really loved is just the confusion surrounding the game, because it was 1982. The confusion of the players, even in the stadium, the coaching staff, the officials, of not knowing what had happened, and even things like you're talking about. Like, can you imagine not knowing the result of a game until the next day, right?
Right. Yeah. I was at my Stanford reunion recently, and a guy told me an amazing story, which was that at the time of the game. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in Swaziland, and he was a big Stanford fan. So his mother recorded the game and sent him a cassette of the game recording to Swaziland. So a month later, he finally gets that tape, listens to it, now having no idea of the outcome, thrilled when Mark Harmon kicks that field goal, and he's there with a bunch of other Peace Corps volunteers, and then learns, listens to the final play and is devastated. So it's a month later that he learned the outcome.
Yeah, that's
Of
amazing.
course, these days again, an outcome like that would be news all around the world within seconds.
Right, within seconds. Right. Um, I one of the things that that I was looking forward to, that I was hoping was going to be there, in a good nonfiction book, and this is a great nonfiction book, is there's room for lots of tangents and background information. You're obviously not writing just about this game, and I love the history that you gave us about the axe, and a lot of this is familiar territory for Stanford or Cal fans, and I've always been intrigued, even as a student. Very early, we're indoctrinated into the mythology of the axe, and we're told about all of these different attempts to steal it from one side or the other. The Immortal 21. I knew of, and I was wondering, were any of these stories? Was there a favorite one of those stories? Either because it was new to you, or because you uncovered something that was new to you, or just you liked it. Was there a favorite one of these axe stealing stories that you came across?
Yeah, no, I have to say my favorite actually involved Cal stealing the axe from Stanford in 1967. If I had known about that growing up, I didn't remember. And it took a little bit of time to find the guy who was behind it. And I don't want to go into the details now because I want to save it for the book. But
But it's a good story.
the guy who stole it, yeah, stealing it from Treasury Union in 1967, and the steps that were involved in pulling that off. I thought it was a fascinating story, but I also, in the book, as you know, Hank, tell the story when Stanford stole the axe, which was the last time some Stanford students back in 1973. I think if you're writing a book like this, you want to get into the hijinks and the pageantry of college football, because that's what makes it different than pro football, right?
For sure. And I know that, I was a student there from 1987 to 1991, and I definitely remember having conversations with my friends talking about, wouldn't it be great to try to steal the axe? And I think there's, the allure of, as a non-football player, just as a common student, to become a part of that history. I should point out that there was no need for us to steal the axe during that time period, but it was just a part of the lore, right? And I'm certain that there were, at the same time, that there were students on the Berkeley campus who were plotting similar things, at least dreaming about it, right? And so I really loved that aspect of the book. I want to ask you real
Yeah,
quick.
I think there's a lot of Stanford and Cal students who thought about stealing the axe. Some even began plotting it. I tell, as you know, of a whole story in 1981, attempt to steal it. But yeah, again, that's just part of, I think, the of the lore, as you mentioned. That I did some interviews of some guys in the 1960s, and there was all sorts of stuff that was going on back then. They used to have card shows at halftime, where the students would a sort of very choreographed way, they would hold up a color and it would spell at certain things. And I think at one point Cal stole all those cards from Stanford, and there was all sorts of things that were going back and forth in the sort of really a lot of hijinks, probably more so than in today.
So obviously you can't tell this story without talking about the bands, and one of the things that I thought was, it was one of these, I'm not sure why it didn't occur to me before reading the book, but obviously there's this huge contrast between the Cal band and the Stanford band. But what I had never really realized, and you explained really well, and maybe you can talk about a little bit here, is there's also a pretty big contrast between each band and the institution that they represent, in terms of, how these two schools are seen. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no. Until 1963, the Stanford and Cal bands were virtually identical. And then the Stanford band went on strike in 1963. The students did, and they ended up getting more control over their activities. In fact, it really became a student-run band with a guy leading the band named Arthur Barnes, who really kind of gave students free run to a certain extent. And meanwhile, the Cal band, we all kind of think of Cal Berkeley during the 1960s as a campus full of the free speech movement, student riots, student protests, free love, all these things that were happening. And the Cal campus was, Cal Berkeley campus was a nexus for it. They kept their traditional marching band. And in the game I write about in 1982, they still had that traditional marching band. And something I discovered in my reporting for the book was that, the Cal grads, they love their band. They're very, very proud of their band. The guys and women who were in the Cal band in 1982, they're very proud of their institution as well. Whereas Stanford, which is traditionally kind of seen as a little more buttoned down than Cal, the Stanford band was much more freewheeling, irreverent, and I would argue, at least at that era, the Stanford band sort of set the culture for certain ways among the student body, and I think a lot of students back in that day really, really liked the band a lot, and we certainly, those of us in the band, we certainly liked ourselves a lot.
I know it was when I was a student, we obviously loved the band. I mean, it was the coolest. It was the coolest thing ever. Just because it's precisely because it was so different, and because they were pushing boundaries, and it was. I mean, it was great. So
was the band banned at all during your time there?
I believe that there were maybe soon after I was there in the early 90s, there was, although the Oregon band, I think
Yeah.
that I was there when they were banned from Oregon,
Right.
because of the owls. They had done something
The
about,
spotted owl.
yes, the endangered spotted owls. And then it
Yeah.
was a few years after I graduated that they were banned from Notre Dame. And
Yeah.
so there
Yeah.
was, there's always something with them.
It just happens.
So the football, I wanted to ask you about John Elway, and because he's obviously one of the main players, one of the main characters in your narrative, and because of when I was there, because of my age, like I knew John Elway. I mean, I obviously knew that he went to Stanford. I knew that he played in this game, but my image of him is as a Denver Bronco, and I see his name in the record book. Talk to me a little bit about how great he was as a Stanford quarterback.
Yeah, Hank, when Elway entered Stanford in 1979, he was the #1 recruit in the country, and he was always kind of like the idea of playing in the what was then called the Pac-10. His dad had been a coach at Washington State, and by the time he graduated, he was considered perhaps the greatest quarterback in the history of college football. But I'll tell you what's really neat, kind of learning about what Elway's time at Stanford was like, was how much he was sort of a regular student. His freshman year, he lived in Toyon, and then his sophomore year, he lived in what they had back then. I think you still had it then. That was called the trailers. So this guy is going to become this, What's that?
I lived in the trailers my junior year. Good times.
Okay. Okay. What was it like living in the trailers? That was not luxury, was it?
It was not luxury. But it it was unique in the sense that, we're not in a dorm, and it was, my 6 best friends, and we were in these 2 adjacent trailers, and we were really isolated, and that was good and bad. I remember some friends would come over to visit us, and it was like, oh, these guys are a little bit different, because we just were. It was, we were in this little mini echo chamber. I remember doing things like we were the we were at the tail end of Manzanita's existence, and I remember spring quarter, we were wrestling and we smashed into the wall, and huge panels of the wood siding came down, and we weren't bothered by this at all. In fact, we took it and we went outside and we had a bonfire with the broken pieces of our trailer. So good times.
Yeah, and so again, John Elway, you can imagine at a place like USC or Alabama or something like
Yeah.
that, he'd be, in a nice place and he would be given everything he needs. But as a sophomore at Stanford, he lived in that kind of substandard place. He lived with his baseball and football buddies. And then his junior and senior years, he lived in what was then the Delt House, which I think is now gone. But that's a neat part for me about the Stanford experience, is that how we all lived with athletes, and some of them went on to be incredible people, or pro athletes, but of course there was all sorts of incredible people in our dorms as well, and that I think is just a neat aspect about life at Stanford.
There was a football player in my freshman dorm, Rinconada, named Cory Booker, who
Oh, sure.
who has gone on to big things. So yes, there's a part of I've liked how the athletes and the superstars are still a part of the Stanford community, which is a cool thing.
So let me tell you, Hank, my quick Cory Booker story. So I'm a reporter now in New Orleans. I cover politics, and Cory Booker came here about 3 years ago to give a speech, and so I caught up with him briefly after his speech, and I said, I introduced myself, told him I was working for the local newspaper, and I told him, by the way, I'm writing a book on the play. And without skipping a beat, he said, his knee was down. So
because it was, but okay. So I let's imagine for a minute that the play never happened, and not for wishful thinking purposes, but just if it had ended the way it likely should have. This was still one of the best big games in history, probably, even if it had ended with Mark Harmon's field goal. Would you agree with that?
no, sure, it was a tight battle, and what people forget, it was that Stanford took the lead with 4 seconds left, thanks to an amazing last minute drive by John Elway. And I tell that story in the book. In fact, that chapter is titled "The Drive," and I was fortunate to interview Elway, kind of like we're doing right now via Zoom. And I thought it was really cool, where John and I watched video of that final drive, and he narrated it for me. So have this Hall of Fame quarterback. I did film study with him, and he was able to kind of capture what was going through his mind and how he handled that kind of a situation. And I tried to provide that in the book. I hope that worked.
Oh, I mean, that was one of, the description of the game just was so well done, and of the entire game, right? And to really give a sense of the swings back and forth with Cal controlling the first half and Stanford coming back in the second half. And after I finished your book last night, the first thing I did was go to YouTube and watched The Drive, because I don't know if I had ever seen it before. I for sure have seen the play a bazillion times, like all of us, but I was able to watch this grainy version of a football drive. And I mean, your description of it was phenomenal. Like, I really did feel like we were inside the huddle, and just with the play calls and everything that went, it just was a highlight of the book for me, was watching that part.
Yeah, so Stanford had 13 players on the field at one point or another during that drive, and
Right.
Cal had 11 players. And I interviewed, I think I interviewed 23 of the, no, I'm sorry, I interviewed 22 of those 24 players. One Cal guy wouldn't talk to me, and one of the Stanford players, unfortunately, Greg Hooper, is now deceased. But you know, I tried to get everybody's perspective and then weave it all together. I did the same thing on the final kickoff of the 22 players. I interviewed 21 of them. The one guy I didn't interview, Moret Ford, is in prison for murder.
I and then if we talk about the play, I think that it was one of these moments where dozens of things had to be true for that result to come about. And the things that, as a Stanford fan, what we focus on is, you know, was his knee down or was it not down? Was this a forward lateral or was it not a forward lateral? But if we put those controversial things aside, what I was most struck by is Joe Cap's role in that. And we haven't talked about Joe Cap. It seemed like he was, on the one hand, a legend, but then also kind of over his head a little bit. Would you agree with that kind of assessment?
Yeah, so Joe Cap was the Cal coach. He was a rookie coach in 1982, had never coached at any level before. And his predecessor, Roger Theater, had been fired the year before after losing the big game to Stanford. And Roger Theater was very popular with the Cal players. And, you know, when that happens, they were sort of questioning Joe Cap coming in. But Joe Cap turns out to be this really charismatic, fiery, just a guy you want to follow. You know, the question with Cap was, what direction did he want to take everybody? But it was really fun researching Joe Cap. There's so many great Joe Cap stories. I was able to put some of them in Five Laterals and a Trombone, but there's so many other ones I wasn't able to use because he's just a classic character. And the funny thing also about Joe Cap is the last time in 1982 that Cal had gone to the Rose Bowl was 1959 when Joe Cap was the quarterback, and Cal hasn't been to the Rose Bowl since then.
Yeah, I think that it was the, you know, I think that this is the mark. This is what I would tell any Stanford fan who's wondering about this book. Is what I found, I was so riveted, even though it's one of these things where you know the result, like you know what happens, but I was so riveted in reading the drive and reading about the play, and especially the aftermath of it. It was because there's a lot of new stuff in there for me, and it was just so fascinating to not just the logistics of it, but the emotions on both sides. And I think what you did so well is that I was devastated for the Stanford players, but I could not help but understand and be happy for the Cal players, which was maybe the most surprising thing that came out of this book is that they were, you know, it's just they're all a part of this great moment in time. And I'm wondering if you could talk real quickly about, and I know we're talking about dozens of players on either side of this outcome, but in general, kind of how do they see their role in it now when they're reflecting on it 40 years later?
Yeah, well, let me answer something else that kind of popped in my mind, and then I'll get to that, which is that, Hank, are you old enough to remember the Columbo TV show?
Yes, I probably saw reruns of it, but for sure, I'm part, you know, it's part of the culture. I'm aware of it. Yes.
So the opening scene of Columbo, as you remember, it you saw who did it, right? It took away the suspense. And then the fun thing after that was to see how Peter Falk, the detective Columbo, figured it out, right? So that was kind of a central thing that I kept in my mind as I researched and then wrote Five Laterals and a Trombone, which is, hey, anybody who reads this book is going to know the outcome. But if I have enough good details and if I can write this in a riveting way, then then the reader's going to want to turn the page to find out what happens next. I interviewed 375 people. I copied 1,500 newspaper articles from the 1982 seasons for Cal and Stanford. And it took me literally over a year to turn those 1,500 PDF copies into Word files that I could have then a giant searchable Word file. And so I just, looking for lots of little details for all of that to be able to tell. And one of the things I feel bad about is so many people gave me great stories that either I could not use in the book. I just had to say, I can't. That's a slightly digression, or it just doesn't propel the story forward. Or I would not name people in the story in the book, just because I thought that people's names would just sort of clutter the manuscript. So, but if that worked for you, I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to do, is to make you want to turn the page to find out what happens next. But you ask about reactions. So, it's now been 40 years since it happened. And, particularly on the Stanford side, I think that's where you get the most interesting reactions. Some of the guys, they kind of think it's neat. They were a part of history, right? And especially the guys who were on the field, the 11 guys who were on the field who I interviewed during the play. Some are still bitter. Some of them do not like being reminded of the outcome and that they were on the field. John Elway, he was quoted immediately after the game as saying it ruined his last game at Stanford and ruined it for his teammates. And he was quite bitter for a long time, but he can now joke about it. And I think he said to me something, what happens if the trombone player had tackled the guy at the 2-yard line?
It's funny because as I was reading it, I started wondering all these things like you're talking about, like if this were to happen today, what would the ruling be? Like if all of a sudden there was a marching band on the field, I can't imagine it would ever happen again. That a band
it will never happen
field.
again. But as you said earlier, Hank, the whole question of the lack of replay, that I think that added a lot to it, because you can imagine these days with replay, with an ending like that, the refs would go off and they would take 10 minutes to study everything, and the scoreboard would be showing the play over and over. And that didn't happen that day. And that just added, I think, to some of the mystique of what happened on November 20th, 1982, was just the utter confusion. And, we were talking about Joe Kapp a minute ago. Joe Kapp runs off at the field, and he doesn't even know who scored the winning touchdown for his team.
Yeah, I think that's what I loved, is how few people knew what had actually happened. And it can be, if you're on the sideline of a football game, that's not the best place to be viewing a football game under ideal circumstances, right? And then if you have all of this other chaos going on, it was really interesting to think about. And just there's so much in this book. And like I said, I loved reading it. I recommend it. Cal fans will obviously love it, but I think that Stanford fans will love it too, because I did. And there's a lot of rich history in there. There's some stuff we didn't even get to talk about. One of my favorite things about the mythology of this game is the fake Daily Californian. And I love that you really kind of dug into that story, because it was, I think that so much of what I know about this game was passed down from, when we got onto campus. You start learning about these things. I'll never forget this. My nephew, who's 11 or 12 years younger than I am, went to Berkeley, and he came back Thanksgiving. We're at Thanksgiving dinner, and he comes straight up to me and says, "Have you ever heard of the play?" And I said, "I've heard of the play. What are you talking about?" Right. So it's just, I'm sure that this happens on both campuses, where it's just a part of the culture. And I was only, I got there 5 years after it, and I'm sure people still are talking about it in both places now.
Well, I could tell you that the Cal campus, the students today are much more familiar with the play than the Stanford students of today. Unfortunately for Cal football, this is their last bright shining moment. 40 years ago. Again, they still haven't gone back to the Rose Bowl since 1959, where Stanford's had a lot more success. This remains, as I said, a great moment for Cal. But if I could take a moment to promo an event, November 15th, the Stanford Historical Society is putting on a panel discussion on the play, and I'll be part of that. So will Gary Terrell, the guy who conceived the idea for the fake newspaper. We're going to have a Cal defensive back and several others there. And that event's going to be on the Stanford campus by the Stanford Historical Society, or people can go to their website and sign up to watch it remotely.
Oh, that's great. I'll have to send a link out for that. This is a great book. Another thing that I really liked, and this is the last thing I need to say, is that they're just the sense of place that you were able to create also. And by that, I mean, as you're describing what's going on, if you were a Stanford student and that Stanford campus, you do a really great job of painting that. And then Cal students will think the same. And I've been to a few big games in Berkeley, and so I could see that scene that you were painting as well. Just really great stuff from beginning to end, and and great stuff here too. So thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with me. This has been lots of fun.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And so, of course, people can get the book at Amazon, but if people want a signed copy, they can order directly from me at tylerbridges.com. Again, tylerbridges.com.
Awesome. Five Laterals and a Trombone. Five Laterals and a Trombone. Great book by Tyler Bridges. Thanks very much, Tyler. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Hank.